31 days after my wife passed away, my son stood in my kitchen and said, "Dad, you're too broken to run the marina anymore." I stared at him, but before I could answer, he added, "Mom knew this day would come." That sentence haunted me all night. The next morning, I stepped into my wife's always locked office. But then the bookcase suddenly clicked open. A hidden basement appeared before me, and when curiosity pulled me inside, what I found there sent chills down my spine. I don't take it for granted that you chose to spend your time here. So tell me in the comments, what city or country are you joining from today? Let's see how far this story travels. This story blends fictional elements with meaningful life lessons. Names and locations are illustrative only, but what this story has to say, and that part is all yours to keep. I did it again. 2 cups. 2 cups of chamomile tea set side by side on the kitchen table like I'd been doing for 38 years. I didn't even realize it until I sat down and looked at the empty chair across from me, the one with the faded blue cushion that Celeste had reupholstered twice because she refused to throw it away. "Sentimental value," she used to say, smoothing her hand over the fabric. "Everything worth keeping has sentimental value, Holden." I picked up my cup and took a sip. The tea was still hot. Hers was already going cold. "My name is Holden Marsh. I am 68 years old. I own Harbor Point Marina, a working boat dock and maritime service yard on the northern edge of Gloucester, Massachusetts, that I built from nothing with my father's hands and my own stubbornness over 40 years. I have 2 children. I had a wife. Had. That word still catches in my throat like a fishhook. Celeste passed 31 days ago. Ovarian cancer stage 4, diagnosed 8 months before the end. We had time to say goodbye, the doctors told us, as if time is something that prepares you. It doesn't. You just watch the person you love get smaller and quieter until one morning the room is too still, and you know before you even open the door. The house still smelled like her. That soft, powdery scent. She wore something French, something expensive, something she ordered twice a year from a boutique in Boston. I hadn't opened any windows since the funeral. I told myself it was because of the April chill coming off the Atlantic. That was a lie, and I knew it. I carried my tea to the window and looked out at the water. From our house on the bluff, you could see the lights of the marina on clear nights, the dock lamps reflecting off the black surface of the harbor, the shapes of boats rocking gently at their moorings. I'd built every inch of that dock, replaced every plank twice. Harbor Point wasn't just a business. It was the physical proof that I had existed, that I had worked, that I had made something real out of nothing. Celeste used to stand at this same window with her tea and say, "You love that marina more than you love me." "Different kind of love," I always told her. She'd laugh and lean her head against my shoulder. Fair enough. My chest tightened so hard I had to set the cup down. The phone buzzed on the counter. I already knew who it was before I picked it up, Reed's name on the screen, calling for the 3rd time this week. Reed is my son, 38 years old. He works in commercial real estate, lives 40 minutes south in Salem, calls me regularly since his mother passed. Which sounds like a good thing. It should be a good thing, I answered. "Dad." His voice was warm, easy. "How are you holding up?" "Still standing," I said. "That's good. That's really good." A brief pause, the kind that means something is coming. "Hey, listen, I was thinking. You've been carrying a lot lately. The marina, the house, everything. Maybe it makes sense to take a step back. Let me handle some of the day-to-day at Harbor Point for a while. Just until you get your feet back under you." I looked at the 2nd cup of tea still steaming faintly on the table. "I've had my feet under me for 68 years, Reed." I know. He laughed softly. "I'm just saying Mom's gone, Dad. You don't have to do everything alone anymore. That's what family is for." Something moved at the edge of my chest. Not suspicion exactly. More like a splinter you can feel but can't see. A pressure in a place you didn't know was tender. I appreciate that, I said. I'll think about it. Great. That's all I'm asking. Another pause, lighter this time. Get some sleep, okay? I love you. Good night, Reed. I hung up and stood there for a long moment, with the phone in my hand. The marina lights blinked slowly in the harbor below. Somewhere out past the breakwater, a buoy bell rang once and went quiet. I'd been managing Harbor Point through a broken collarbone, a recession, 2 hurricanes, and the death of my father. I did not need to step back. Not now, not ever. But the way Reed said it, smooth, practiced almost too gentle, stayed with me long after I'd rinsed out both cups and turned off the kitchen light. I stood outside Celeste's office door at the end of the hall. I'd been avoiding it for 31 days. Every morning I walked past it. Every morning I kept going. Not tomorrow. Tomorrow I'd go in. I'd pack up her desk, sort through her files, do what needed doing. I was ready. I put my hand on the doorknob. I hadn't been in there since the funeral. I told myself I was ready. I wasn't. The morning light came in thin and gray through the hallway window. The kind of April light that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be winter or spring. I stood at her door for a full minute before I turned the knob. The smell hit me first. That soft, powdery French perfume still there, still clinging to the curtains and the upholstery, and the air itself, like she'd just stepped out for a moment and was coming right back. My throat closed. My eyes went hot, and I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and stood there in the doorway, breathing through my nose until the wave passed. "Get it together, Holden," I said out loud. Because sometimes you have to talk to yourself like you'd talk to a man standing on a ledge. I stepped inside. Celeste's office was exactly as she'd left it. Her desk cleared, but not empty. A ceramic mug holding a handful of pens, a framed photo of the two of us at Harbor Point's 25th anniversary, a small potted succulent she'd named Gerald that had somehow survived a month without water. Her travel planning materials covered the bookshelf along the far wall, spiral-bound trip logs, laminated nautical charts, glossy brochures for luxury coastal tours from Maine to the Florida Keys. She had managed high-end maritime tourism for 15 years. Chartered boats, private yacht excursions, 5-star coastal experiences for clients who flew in from New York and Chicago, and sometimes London. She was good at it. Better than good, she was exceptional. Clients requested her by name. She had an instinct for what people wanted before they knew they wanted it themselves. I pulled the first box from the closet and started with the bookshelf. Travel journals. I stacked them carefully. Brochures. A folder of old client correspondence. A rolled nautical chart of the New England coastline with notations in her handwriting. Departure points, anchorages, points of interest. I worked for about an hour before I got to the filing cabinet in the corner. It was heavy, a 4-drawer steel unit she'd had since before we moved into this house. I needed to shift it away from the wall to reach the electrical socket behind it where she'd kept a power strip for her laptop. I braced my legs and pulled. The cabinet rolled easier than I expected. My foot caught on the edge of the rug. I went sideways, my shoulders slamming into the decorative wooden molding along the side of the bookcase, a long strip of dark-stained trim I'd always assumed was purely ornamental. A sound, soft and mechanical. A single click. I straightened up, rubbing my shoulder, and looked at the bookcase. It had moved. Not much, maybe 2 inches, but enough that a thin line of darkness had appeared along the left edge where the unit met the wall. I reached out and pushed. The entire bookcase swung inward on a hidden pivot, smooth and nearly silent, like it had been designed to be opened and closed 1,000 times. Cold air breathed out from the darkness beyond. Not the damp cold of neglect, something else. something controlled, like a room that had been maintained. My heart was doing something strange, not racing, just louder. Each beat deliberate like a fist knocking on a door. What in the... My voice came out rough. I cleared my throat. Celeste. Not calling her. Just saying her name the way you do when something doesn't make sense and you need to anchor yourself to something real. I took my phone from my pocket and turned on the flashlight. The beam caught the edge of a narrow staircase, wooden steps, clean, no dust, descending into the dark below the house. I stood at the top and shone the light down. At the bottom, I could see the edge of a concrete floor. I went down. 12 steps, each one deliberate. The cold deepened as I descended, and with it a smell I couldn't immediately name, paper metal, something faintly chemical, like a photo lab, like preservation. The room at the bottom was larger than I expected. Maybe 20 feet across, low ceiling, a single overhead fixture. I found the light switch on the wall to my left and flipped it. The fluorescent light buzzed once and came on. I stood there in the doorway and couldn't move. The walls were covered, photographs printed and pinned in careful rows, maps with handwritten notations, printed boarding passes and hotel confirmations in clear plastic sleeves, handwritten letters. 2 full shelving units along the back wall, neatly organized, labeled binders, stackable storage boxes, a filing tray on the desk in the corner. A desk. There was a desk down here. She had a desk. 38 years. I had lived in this house for 38 years, and I had never known this room existed. My legs moved before my brain caught up. I crossed to the nearest wall and looked at the photographs. The first one I focused on stopped me cold. Celeste, standing on the deck of a sailing yacht. I didn't recognize, wearing a sundress I'd never seen, laughing the way she used to laugh when something genuinely surprised her head. Back eyes crinkled, completely unguarded. Beside her stood a man I had never seen before in my life. Tall, silver-haired sunglasses, one hand resting easy on the rail, and on either side of them Reed and Lena, my children. Younger Reed, maybe 16, 17, Lena, maybe 13, 14, but unmistakably my children. All 4 of them, smiling, together, written in Celeste's handwriting in the white border at the bottom of the photograph. Summer 2004, our real family. The room was very quiet. My own breathing sounded strange to me, too slow, too controlled, like a man trying not to let on that something inside him had just come apart. Our real family. I looked at the man in the photograph again. My eyes moved over him the way you move a flashlight over something you're not sure you're seeing correctly, carefully, methodically looking for the thing that explains what you're looking at. His hands first. Large-knuckled, the left thumb slightly crooked from an old break. His posture, that particular way of standing with the weight, shifted to the right hip, and then just below the cuff of his sleeve, a small, pale scar on the inner side of his left wrist, crescent-shaped from a boat cleat that had caught him at 17 years old. I had been there when it happened. My heart didn't break. It stopped. Because somewhere buried under 38 years of trust, under every morning cup of tea and every quiet evening, and every time I had believed without question that the life I was living was the life that was real, I recognized that man. I don't know how long I stood there holding that first photograph. Long enough for my legs to start aching. Long enough for the fluorescent light above me to buzz twice and flicker. Long enough that when I finally moved, it was less a decision and more a surrender. My body just started walking toward the shelves, because standing still was no longer something I was capable of. The albums were arranged by year. I could see the labels from where I stood, small white stickers in the bottom right corner of each spine written in Celeste's neat, unhurried handwriting. I reached for the one marked 2005. Hawaii. She was wearing a yellow dress I'd never seen. standing on a black sand beach somewhere on the Big Island, her hair loose, her feet bare, laughing at something the man beside her had just said. He was laughing too, that easy, unguarded laugh of someone who feels completely at home. Reed was maybe 23, 24, standing slightly behind them, with a shaved ice in his hand, grinning. Lena was maybe 19, pressed against Celeste's side, squinting into the sun. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. I'd expected them to shake. Instead, they just turned pages slowly, methodically, the way you move through something when your brain refuses to accept what your eyes are seeing. Alaska, 2007. The four of them on a glacier tour, matching Thermal Gear Mountains, behind them so white they looked painted. Celeste's cheeks red from the cold, her eyes bright. Bahamas, 2009. A catamaran at sunset. Celeste, in a wide-brimmed hat, the man's arm around her shoulders, easy and familiar, the way you touch someone you've touched 10,000 times. Colorado, 2011. A mountain lodge. Snow on the windows. The four of them around a dinner table with candles and wine, the kind of photograph someone takes when they want to remember a moment forever. Florida, 2013. A houseboat on the Intracoastal. Lena driving from the upper deck, laughing. The man teaching Reed how to tie a cleat hitch on the stern rail. I set the album down and pressed both palms flat against the desk and breathed. Just 3 days, Holden. You know how these scouting trips are. I have to check the anchorages myself. You can't trust third-party reports. I had nodded. Every single time I had nodded. I had kissed her cheek and told her to drive safe and gone back to Harbor Point and worked. I had never once questioned her. Not once in 38 years had I looked at my wife and thought she is lying to me. My jaw tightened until my teeth hurt. On the wall above this desk was a large nautical chart of the eastern United States coastline mounted in a frame. I leaned in close. She'd gone over it in red marker small circles at dozens of locations along the coast and inland, each one annotated in her handwriting. Dates. Just dates. March 2006, August 2008, November 2010, June 2012. I pulled my phone out and opened my calendar app, going back as far as it would let me. I cross-referenced the first 4 dates I could read. March 2006, Celeste scouting trip, 4 days, Northeast Corridor. August 2008, Celeste conference. New England tour operators, 3 days. November 2010, Celeste client site visit overnight. Every date on that map matched a gap in my calendar where Celeste had been somewhere that wasn't here. Not close. Not approximate. Exact. I said out loud to nobody, she planned this like a business, because she had. That was the thing that hit me then, not the betrayal itself, but the architecture of it. The careful, sustained, years-long construction of a parallel life. This room wasn't the work of impulse or accident. It was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway, over and over for decades, while I set 2 cups of tea on the table every evening and waited for her to come home. The metal drawer under the desk had a small lock. The key was taped to the underside of the desktop. I found it when I crouched down, still thinking like the man who had built Harbor Point from nothing. The man who knew that the most important things are always stored close to where you stand. Inside the drawer, 3 cassette tapes in paper sleeves. A journal with a dark green cover, the spine cracked from use. And beneath those, a manila envelope marked with 2 names. Reed. Lena. I opened the envelope. The document inside was a paternity test, a private laboratory dated 2003. 2 separate results, each on its own page. I read Reed's first. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the way a boat does when a wake catches you from the side. Reed's result confirmed a biological match. He was mine. I turned to Lena's page. Biological relationship to Holden Marsh, none detected. Paternal match, Vincent Hale. The paper crinkled in my grip. Lena, 34 years old. I had been in the delivery room when she was born. I had held her before Celeste did, because the nurses passed her to me first. I had paced the hallway outside the NICU for 6 hours when she had trouble breathing at 2 days old, and I had wept, actually wept, like I hadn't since my father died, when they told me she was going to be Vincent Hale. I said the name out loud, and it tasted like metal on my tongue. I went back to the photograph on the wall. The man, his hands, the crescent scar. Then I looked at the framed photo I'd found in the second album, a casual shot, black and white, 2 young men standing beside an old wooden dinghy on a Cape Ann beach. One of them was me, maybe 30 years old, squinting into the sun. The other stood beside me with his hand on the bow of the boat, laughing at something off camera. I hadn't put that photo there. I had never seen it in this room before tonight. Celeste had kept it. She had brought it down here and put it on the wall of her secret room where she kept everything that mattered to her. I looked at the man in the recent photographs. I looked at the young man in the old one. Same hands, same scar, same slight forward lean of the shoulders when he laughed. The name Vincent Hale had no records before 1989. I didn't know that yet, not for certain. But standing in that basement room with fluorescent light humming above me and the smell of old photographs in my nose, I knew it the way you know something before you can prove it. Vincent Hale didn't exist before the storm, but Caspian Marsh did. My legs gave out. Not dramatically, no stumbling, no grabbing at the wall. Just a slow, deliberate fold, the way old timber settles. I found the chair at the desk and sat down hard, both hands flat on my thighs, staring at the wall of photographs without really seeing them anymore. Caspian. My voice came out like gravel. You son of a Caspian. The last time I had said my brother's name out loud, with any real feeling behind it, was at his memorial service 35 years ago. I had stood at the edge of the water with my father, and said it into the wind, because there was no grave to stand over, no body to bury. The Atlantic had taken him and kept him the way it sometimes does, except it hadn't. I reached for the green journal. The cover was soft with handling. She'd read this thing, reread it, carried it back and forth from the drawer to the desk and back again over years. The first page had a date, January 2002. 23 years ago. I'd been 55 years old. We'd been married for 15 years. Reed was in college. Lena was in high school. I read the first entry out loud to myself because somehow that made it more real, and somehow more real was what I needed. He's alive. After everything, after all these years, Caspian is alive. He called me from a number I didn't recognize. And when I heard his voice, I dropped the phone and had to sit on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes before I could pick it up again. He sounds different, older, tired. But it's him. It's him. My chest cracked open like a hull on a reef. She had known since 2002. For 23 years, she had known my brother was alive. She had sat across from me at our kitchen table and watched me light a candle at his memorial every October and said nothing. Not one word. I turned pages. My hands were trembling now, fine tremors, the kind you can't control, like a motor idling too rough. Caspian says Holden left him. Says he was screaming and Holden swam away. I don't know what to believe. I only know that Caspian needs me and I'm not going to turn away from him again. Turn away from him again. I repeated, my voice cracking on the last word. I kept reading. I married Holden because he was steady, because he was safe. Because when you're 26 years old and the world feels like it's spinning too fast, safe feels like love. But it isn't love. It's just shelter. I set the journal down on the desk and pressed my knuckle hard against my mouth because something was rising in my throat that I didn't want to let out. Not grief. Something uglier than grief. Something with teeth. Shelter, I said through my knuckle. 38 years, and I was just shelter. I picked up the first cassette tape. The recorder was at the bottom of the drawer, a small handheld unit, old but functional batteries still in it. She'd kept it charged down here. Of course she had. I pressed play. Celeste's voice filled the basement room. Clear, unhurried, intimate, the voice she used when she thought no one was listening. Holden is a good man. I want to be clear about that. He has always been a good man, but goodness isn't the same as fire. Goodness doesn't make you feel like you're standing on the bow of a boat in a storm, completely alive, terrified, exhilarated. Caspian does that. Caspian always did. A pause on the tape. Then Caspian's voice, deeper than I remembered, rougher but unmistakable. He left me out there, Celeste. I was in the water calling his name and he swam away. Celeste, gently, I know. Caspian, he chose to live. He chose himself over me. Celeste, yes, he did. I stopped the tape. My whole body went rigid. I sat there with the recorder in my hands, and I felt something I had not felt since I was a young man, a kind of fury so clean and cold, it was almost indistinguishable from calm. He was wrong. Caspian was wrong, and she had let him stay wrong. The night of the storm came back to me the way bad memories always do, not in order, not smoothly, but in fragments. The sound the water made when I hit it the first time, the cold so violent it knocked the air out of my lungs. Caspian's voice somewhere ahead of me in the dark, my hands reaching, finding nothing. Coming up, being pulled toward the boat by the rescue line, screaming at the crew to go back, going back in. The second wave, my ribs on the left side catching something, a submerged line, a piece of wreckage, the crack audible even underwater. Being dragged up by Dorian's hands while I was still shouting my brother's name until I had no voice left. I had 3 cracked ribs for 6 weeks after that night. I had mourned Caspian every October for 35 years. And my wife, the woman I made tea for every evening, the woman whose perfume still haunted every room of our house, had spent 23 years telling my brother that I had chosen to swim away. You fed him that, I said to the room, to the journal, to the photographs on the wall. You found him, and the first thing you did was make sure he hated me. Because if he didn't hate me, if he ever found out what actually happened, he might have forgiven me. And then you would have lost him. My voice broke on the last word. I pressed the heel of my hand against my eyes and held it there until the burning stopped. I sat like that for a while. I don't know how long. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere above me, the house creaked in the wind off the water. When I finally lowered my hand, I noticed the folder I hadn't opened yet. It had slid to the side of the desk when I'd reached for the recorder. A plain manila folder, thicker than the others, with a typed label on the tab. Harbor Point Redevelopment Preliminary Transfer Agreement. I opened it. The first page had 3 names at the top. Reed Marsh, Lena Marsh. And beneath them, as the designated acquiring party, Merrick Voss Atlantic Shore Development, LLC. There was a sticky note on the second page in Celeste's handwriting. When H is weak enough, R handles signature, L handles paperwork. C reclaims what was always his. H.C. Holden, Caspian. She hadn't even used our full names. We were just letters in a plan she'd been running for 30 years. I closed the folder carefully, set it back on the desk. Stood up slowly, my knees protesting. and looked at the wall of photographs one last time before I turned off the light. This wasn't just a betrayal anymore. This was a 30-year heist. I read the whole folder twice. Not because I didn't understand it the first time. I understood it perfectly the first time. I read it twice because some part of me kept waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something less than what they were. They didn't. The document was 43 pages. A full preliminary transfer agreement for Harbor Point Marina, the dock, the service yard, the fuel station, the storage facilities, the 3 commercial moorings on the north end that I'd added in 2019 after 2 years of permit negotiations. Everything. Packaged and labeled and ready for signatures. The acquiring party was listed as Atlantic Shore Development, LLC, registered in Delaware. Principal Officer Merrick Voss. Behind Merrick Voss, in the ownership structure buried in the appendix, was a name listed as silent partner. Vincent Hale. My father had driven a delivery truck for 22 years to save enough money to buy the original plot of land at Harbor Point. He had walked me down to that scrubby, overgrown waterfront lot on a Saturday morning in 1984 and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "This is where we start, son. Everything else comes from here." He had laid every one of the original dock pilings himself. His hands had touched every inch of that ground. Caspian had stood on that dock with us, grinning like an idiot, paint on his jeans from helping us seal the first boathouse wall. He'd said, "Dad, I think we built something." And our father had laughed so hard his eyes watered. Now the man wearing Caspian's face had his name on a document designed to take it all away. I put the folder down on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the cool concrete floor and breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth slowly until the heat behind my eyes pulled back. I was not going to fall apart in this basement. I refused. What I was going to do was document everything. I spent the next 90 minutes photographing every single item in that room. Every album page, every pinned photograph, every notation on the nautical chart, every page of the journal, both sides of each cassette tape label, every page of the Harbor Point transfer agreement, including the appendix. I was methodical about it the way I'd been methodical when I built the marina, the way my father had been methodical when he laid those first pilings. One thing at a time. Completely. Then the next. When I was done, I turned off the light. I walked back up the narrow stairs. I pushed the bookcase back into position until I heard the soft click of the latch engaging. I stood in Celeste's office in the last gray light of evening and looked at the room as though I'd just come in to pack a few boxes. Perfectly ordinary. Nothing disturbed. Nothing found. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Reed. I answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad." Warm, easy, practiced. "How are you doing? You eat anything today?" "I had lunch," I said, which was a lie. I hadn't eaten since that morning. "Good, good." The brief pause I'd learned to recognize. "Listen, I've been thinking with everything on your plate right now, maybe it makes sense for me to step in at the marina. Just day-to-day stuff. Take some weight off you." "You seem in a hurry, Reed," I said pleasantly, a short laugh. "Not at all, Dad. You're just getting older. There's nothing wrong with asking for help." "I'll think about it," I said. "Good night." I set the phone face down on Celeste's desk and stood there with my hand on it for a moment. Getting older. As if age were the variable here. As if the problem with Holden Marsh was simply that he'd run out of useful years. I slept poorly. I was up before 5. At 9:15 the next morning, Lena's car pulled into the driveway. She came through the front door the way she always did, knock once, then open, calling out, "Dad!" Before she was fully inside, her voice bright and familiar and achingly normal. She was wearing a gray sweater, and her hair was down, and she looked so much like herself, like the girl I had raised, that the pain of it hit me somewhere below the ribs. She crossed the kitchen and hugged me with both arms, pressing her face against my shoulder, the way she used to do when she was small, and something had frightened her. I put my arm around her. I held her. My eyes went hot, and I stared at the wall over her head and kept my jaw tight. "How are you holding up?" she asked, pulling back to look at my face. Her eyes were soft with what looked like genuine concern, and I thought, "You are very good at this, Lena. You always were." "Managing," I said. She sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug I set in front of her, and her expression shifted into something more careful. "Dad, I've been thinking." Mom had a lot of thoughts about the marina. She talked to me about it not long before she passed. She looked up at me steadily. She thought it might be time to let it go. Said it was connected to too much grief. She wanted you to be free of it. I looked at my daughter. I looked at her eyes and her hands, and the careful, rehearsed gentleness in her voice, and I thought about the night she was born. About the 6 hours I had paced the hallway outside the NICU, with my heart in my throat while the nurses worked. About every school play and every driving lesson and every Sunday dinner and every time she'd called me from college just to talk. I taught you how to ride a bike. I sat up all night when you had a fever at 7 years old, and you were performing the whole time. That's very thoughtful of you to share, I said, keeping my voice even. I'll give it some thought. She studied my face for a moment, and something flickered behind her eyes, uncertainty maybe, or the first hairline crack of doubt. Then she smiled and reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We just love you, Dad. That's all this is." "I know," I said. She left 20 minutes later. I watched her car back out of the driveway and turn toward the main road and disappear. Then I went to the kitchen counter and gripped the edge with both hands and dropped my head and let out a long, shaking breath that I'd been holding, and she walked in. There was only one person in the world I needed to talk to. I grabbed my keys. Dorian Hale lived 11 minutes from my house in a small, cedar-shingled place on the water's edge that he'd owned for 30 years. He had been my closest friend since we were 12 years old. He had been a Coast Guard rescue swimmer for 22 years. He had retired with 2 commendations, a bad knee, and a memory for detail that was almost frightening. He had been on the rescue boat the night of the storm in 1988. I needed someone who had been there that night. Someone who remembered what happened the way it actually happened, not the way Celeste had rewritten it. I put the car in reverse and backed out of my driveway. Dorian answered the door before I knocked. He'd seen my truck in the driveway from the kitchen window. He always did. The man had the situational awareness of someone who'd spent 2 decades pulling people out of the Atlantic in the dark. He was standing in the doorway in a flannel shirt and work pants, a mug of coffee in one hand, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the moment he saw my face, his expression shifted from mild surprise to something much more serious. "Come in," he said. "Not what's wrong or you okay. Just come in," which was one of the things I'd always valued most about Dorian Hale. He knew when talking could wait. His kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the faint salt tang that got into every house on this stretch of coast eventually. A small radio on the counter was playing something old and low, a jazz station out of Boston. He turned it off without being asked, pulled out the chair across from his at the kitchen table and sat down. I sat. I put the envelope of printed photographs on the table between us. I'd stopped at a print shop on the way over and printed the 20 clearest shots from my phone. "Look at those," I said. "Tell me who that is." Dorian set down his coffee and picked up the first photograph. The summer 2004 shot Celeste on the yacht deck. The man beside her, Reed and Lena on either side. He looked at it the way he used to look at rescue reports, systematically, without expression, moving from detail to detail. Then the color drained out of his face. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had pulled a drain plug somewhere below his jaw. "That's Caspian," he said. His voice came out rough, like the words had scraped something on the way out. He looked up at me. "Holden, that is Caspian." "I know." "He's that man is supposed to be dead." "I know that too." Dorian put the photograph down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Dorian Hale was not a man who was easily shaken. I had watched him pull a teenage boy out of a capsized hull in 12-foot swells and crack a joke on the way back to shore to keep the kid from going into shock. Seeing him shaken now made something cold move through my chest. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning. Don't leave anything out." So I did. It took 40 minutes. I talked and Dorian listened, refilling my coffee once without asking, his eyes never leaving my face. I told him about the bookcase, the stairs, the room, the photographs going back to 2004, the nautical chart with the red circles, the ADN results, the journal, the cassette tapes, the Harbor Point transfer agreement with Merrick Voss and Vincent Hale on the cover page. When I finished, Dorian leaned back in his chair and rubbed both hands hard over his face, a gesture I recognized as him buying time to organize his thoughts before he spoke. "Okay," he said, finally, his voice steady again. "Okay. First, how are you still sitting upright right now? Because falling over doesn't fix anything," I said. "Fair." He picked up the photograph again, studying Caspian's face with the focused intensity of a man running a positive ID. The scar on his wrist, still there, same crescent shape. And the way he stands, right hip forward, left shoulder slightly dropped. Exactly. Dorian set the photo down and pointed at me. "That's Caspian. I would stake 30 years of rescue work on it. Holden, this isn't just heartbreak." His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping. "This has the smell of something criminal. Fraud, conspiracy, possibly extortion if they'd actually pressured me into signing," I said. "I know. You need a lawyer. I already know which one. But first I need something else." I looked at him steadily. "You were on the rescue boat that night, Dorian. November 1988. You were there." Something moved across his face, an old shadow, the kind that never fully leaves. "I was there. I need you to tell me exactly what you remember. Because Caspian believes I swam away. He believes I chose to save myself and left him out there." My voice stayed level, but my hands tightened around the coffee mug, hard enough that my knuckles went white. Someone put that in his head, and I think I know who. Dorian stood up abruptly. He crossed to the back hallway and came back 2 minutes later, carrying a cardboard box, old, the corners soft with age, the lid held down with a rubber band that had gone brittle. He set it on the table and pulled off the lid. Inside were folders, official Coast Guard rescue logs, photocopies neatly labeled by date. "I kept copies of everything from my years on active rotation," he said, flipping through the tabs with practiced fingers. "November 14th, 1988. Here." He pulled a folder and opened it flat on the table between us. We both leaned in. We both leaned in. The report used our birth name, Calloway, was our mother's family name, the one we'd grown up with before Dad legally changed it to Marsh in 1990. The report was typed on official form paper, the ink faded to light gray but fully legible. I read it and my throat closed. Subject R. Calloway entered the water at 23:47 in an attempt to locate missing subject C. Calloway. Subject R. Calloway was recovered by rescue line at 23:52 in a disoriented state. Subject R. Calloway re-entered the water at 23:58, disregarding verbal order to stand down. Subject R. Calloway was recovered at 0004 by rescue swimmer D. Hale, unresponsive. Resuscitation required. Subject transported to Addison Gilbert Hospital with suspected rib fractures and hypothermia. My eyes stung. I pressed my thumb and forefinger hard against the bridge of my nose and held them there. You didn't abandon Caspian. Dorian said, his voice rough with something that sounded close to anger. You went in twice. The second time you went under and didn't come back up on your own. I pulled you out myself. He pointed at the report. It's right there, in writing, dated and signed. Someone made him believe otherwise, I said, and my voice came out barely above a whisper. Dorian looked at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly and with great deliberateness, Celeste. Yes. She found him first, and the first thing she told him was that you left him. His jaw worked. She didn't just betray you, Holden. She destroyed 2 brothers. She took everything you had with Caspian and she burned it deliberately so he would need her and only her. The words landed on me like stones, each one accurate, each one exactly right. I exhaled, long and slow and shaking slightly. There's one more person I need. Who? Stellan Cross. He was in the water support team that night. He saw the whole thing from the secondary boat. I looked up at Dorian. Is he still in Rockport? Dorian nodded slowly. Still there. 72 years old, half-deaf, stubborn as a barnacle. The edge of his mouth moved. If anyone can put the final nail in this, it's Stellan. Then we find Stellan, I said. The drive to Rockport took 25 minutes along Route 127, the road that hugs the coastline north of Gloucester, with the Atlantic on one side and granite outcroppings on the other. Dorian drove. I sat in the passenger seat with my hands loose in my lap and watched the water. You doing okay over there? Dorian asked somewhere around the halfway point. Ask me again in an hour, I said. He nodded and didn't push it. That was Dorian. Stellan Cross lived in a small gray cape at the end of a gravel lane that dead-ended 20 feet from the high tide mark. The yard was exactly what you'd expect from a 72-year-old former rescue swimmer who'd never fully left the water behind lobster traps stacked along the fence line, coils of old rope hung on wooden pegs, a pair of oilskin jackets draped over the porch railing. A weather vane shaped like a whale on the roof peak spun slowly in the May wind. Dorian knocked, footsteps inside heavy, unhurried. The door opened. Stellan Cross was a big man gone lean with age, with a white beard cropped close and eyes so pale they were almost colorless, the kind of eyes the sea gives to people who've spent decades staring at its horizon. He looked at Dorian first, nodded once in recognition, then his gaze moved to me. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the expression of a man who has been expecting a particular conversation for a very long time and has finally stopped wondering when it would arrive. Holden Marsh, he said. His voice was low and deliberate, each word placed carefully, like he was setting stones. I wondered if you'd ever come looking. My chest tightened. You knew I'd come. Figured you would. Someday. He stepped back from the door. Come in, both of you. I'll put coffee on. His kitchen was small and warm, smelling of pine and salt and strong coffee. He moved around it with the careful economy of a man whose knees had opinions, filling the percolator, pulling mugs from the cabinet, not speaking until he'd set everything on the table and sat down across from us. November 14th, 1988, I said. Stellan wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at me steadily. What do you want to know? Everything you saw, from the moment the distress call came in. Stellan exhaled through his nose a long, measured breath and began. We got the call at 23:42. Storm had been building since early evening, swells running 8 to 10 feet by the time we launched. Your boat had gone over on its starboard side about a quarter-mile offshore past the breakwater. His eyes went slightly distant, the way eyes do when memory takes over. We had 2 vessels in the water. Dorian's team on the primary. I was on secondary support, about 40 yards off. And you could see clearly, I asked. Clear enough. We had the spotlights on the water. He pointed at me. I saw you go in the first time. You hit the water and went under and came back up swimming hard toward where the boat had been. You were calling his name. I could hear you over the wind, that's how loud you were calling. My throat constricted. I pressed my fist against my sternum and held it there. You didn't find him on the first dive. Stellan continued, his voice never wavering. Dorian's team pulled you back to the primary vessel. You were fighting them, I could see that too. You didn't want to come out of the water. He looked at Dorian. You had to physically restrain him, if I recall. Had my arm across his chest the whole time he was on the rail. Dorian said, his jaw tight. He kept trying to go back over. Then you went in again, Stellan said, eyes back on me. Second time, that was maybe 6-7 minutes after they pulled you out. You went over the rail before anyone could stop you. Dorian went in right behind you. He paused. You went under and you didn't come back up on your own. Dorian brought you up. You were... He stopped, cleared his throat, started again. You were not responsive when they got you onto the deck. The room felt very quiet around those words. He was gone by then, I said. My voice came out rough and low. Caspian. The current had him by then, yes. We searched until 0300. Called it at first light. Stellan looked at me without flinching. Holden. You went in twice in a November Atlantic. You had 3 cracked ribs and hypothermia. You did not walk away from your brother. You were carried away from him. There is a difference. I pressed my thumb and forefinger so hard against the bridge of my nose that the cartilage ached. My eyes were burning. I was not going to cry at Stellan Cross's kitchen table. I refused. But something enormous was moving through my chest, something that had been lodged there for 35 years, working loose at last, and the sensation was so overwhelming that for a moment I couldn't speak at all. You said you were expecting me, I managed finally. Why? Stellan got up from the table and went to the back bedroom. He returned carrying a wooden box flat about the size of a shoebox, the wood dark with age. He set it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside, in a clear plastic sleeve, was a handwritten document. Not a typed form, a personal log entry in Stellan's own hand, dated November 15th, 1988. He pushed it across to me. I read it. My hands were shaking fine, involuntary tremors that I couldn't control any more than I could control my heartbeat. The words swam slightly before they steadied. R. Calloway entered the water a second time, at approximately 23:58, disregarding the order to retreat issued by rescue team lead. R. Calloway was recovered by D. Hale at 0004, unresponsive. No voluntary breathing observed on recovery. Resuscitation required en route to Addison Gilbert Hospital. R. Calloway was screaming C. Calloway's name at time of second entry. I have served 12 years in active maritime rescue. I have not seen a man go back in under those conditions before or since. I set the page down flat on the table and put both hands over it and dropped my head. 35 years. 35 years of carrying the weight of that night like an accusation. 35 years of the quiet, corrosive fear that Maybe I could have done more, gone farther, held on longer. That some part of my survival that night had been a choice. It hadn't been. It was right here in writing, dated, witnessed, in the hand of a man with no reason to lie. "Whoever told Caspian you abandoned him?" Stellan said quietly, leaning forward, his pale eyes fixed on mine. "That person lied, deliberately and completely." I lifted my head. My jaw was tight enough that it ached. "I know who it was." "Then make sure Caspian knows too." I nodded once. I picked up the page and slid it carefully back into its plastic sleeve and handed it back to Stellan, who shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "I made that copy for you 20 years ago, just in case." On the drive back, the Atlantic sliding past, outside Dorian's window, in the late afternoon light. His phone buzzed on the center console. He glanced at it, and his expression sharpened. "My contact at the Federal Maritime Registry," he said, reading. He turned the screen toward me. "Vincent Hale. Searched full federal and state records. No birth certificate. No social security issuance. No records of any kind prior to March 1989. The identity was constructed. It did not exist before that date." I read it twice. Then I looked out the windshield at the road unspooling ahead of us. "Then it's time I found a lawyer," I said. Calder Flynn's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Federal Street in Boston, with a view of the harbor that on clear days stretched all the way to the outer islands. I'd sat in the chair across from his desk more times than I could count over the past 20 years. Lease agreements, contractor disputes, zoning appeals, the trust paperwork when my father passed. Calder knew Harbor Point the way a doctor knows a patient's chart. Every bone, every scar, every history. He was 64 years old, silver-haired with a face built for courtrooms, sharp jaw, steady eyes, the kind of expression that gave nothing away until he chose to give it. He was already standing when his assistant showed me in, and he shook my hand with both of his in the way he only did when something serious was in the room. "Holden, sit down." He gestured to the chair. "You look like a man who hasn't slept properly in 2 weeks." 3 weeks, I said, sitting. "Give or take." I put the folder on his desk, the printed photographs, the photographed pages of the journal, and the transfer agreement. The ADN results, the rescue log copies from Dorian and Stellan, and the Maritime Registry message about Vincent Hale. "Read it," I said. "All of it. I'll wait." Calder picked up the first page. His face went through a series of small, controlled adjustments as he read, a slight tightening around the eyes. Here, a compression of the mouth, there. The professional equivalent of a man keeping his reactions on a very short leash. He read without speaking. He turned pages steadily, unhurried, giving each document its full attention. When he reached the Harbor Point transfer agreement with Vincent Hale listed as silent partner, he stopped. He turned back one page, read it again. Then he set the whole stack down, took off his glasses, and rubbed both eyes with his thumb and forefinger. "How long have you known?" he asked. 3 weeks. He looked up at me sharply. "And you haven't said anything to Reed or Lana in 3 weeks?" Not a word. Something moved across Calder's face that might, in a different context, have been admiration. "All right." He put his glasses back on and straightened in his chair. "Talk me through what you want." "I want Harbor Point protected," I said. "Locked down so tight that nobody, not Reed, not Lena, not Caspian, not Merrick Voss, not any Delaware shell company with a clean logo and a dirty purpose can touch it without my explicit written authorization." "A discretionary trust," Calder said immediately. "You transfer Harbor Point Marina into a trust structure. You remain the sole beneficiary and the sole authorized signatory during your lifetime. Any transfer of assets requires your direct written consent witnessed by me, notarized with a 72-hour waiting period built in." He paused. "The 72 hours makes it essentially impossible to pressure someone into signing in the moment. Do it. Holden, if they're planning to pressure you into signing, and based on what I'm reading, that's exactly what this is. We need to move first." He leaned forward across the desk, his voice dropping to something measured and precise. "Once this trust is filed and recorded, their entire plan collapses. They can't transfer what they don't legally have access to." The corner of his mouth tightened. "This will make them desperate." "Good," I said. "Desperate people make mistakes," Calder said. "I'm counting on it." He pulled a fresh legal pad from the drawer and uncapped his pen. "I'll have the trust documents drafted by end of week. We'll execute them here with 2 witnesses fully notarized. I'll personally file with the registry." He looked at me over the top of his glasses. "I'll also be preparing a separate file, the forged transfer agreement, the journal evidence, the ADN results. If this goes where I think it might go, we want everything ready for law enforcement." "Not yet," I said. "Not until I'm ready." Calder studied me for a moment. "You have something else in mind." "I do." I looked out the window at the harbor, the gray-blue water, the boats, the line of the horizon. "I'm going to let them think it's still working. I'm going to give them one more push toward the finish line." I turned back to him. "And then I'm going to pull the floor out from under them in public." Calder set his pen down and looked at me the way he'd looked at me 30 years ago, when I'd told him I was going to build a full-service marina on a patch of overgrown coastal land with $40,000 and a borrowed backhoe. "You've always had the most unsettling kind of patience," he said. "My father taught me," I said. "Now, let's sign the papers." I walked out of Calder's office at 4:30, with a copy of the executed trust documents in my briefcase, and something I hadn't felt in 3 weeks settling into my chest. Not comfort, exactly, but solidity. The ground was back under my feet. My phone buzzed as I reached the elevator. Otto Briggs. My marina manager, 22 years. I answered. "Otto, Mr. Marsh." His voice was careful, low, the way it got when he had something to say that he didn't enjoy saying. "I thought you should know. Reed was here this afternoon. Brought a man in a suit I didn't recognize, Voss, I think his name was. They walked the whole property. The dock, the service yard, the north moorings." A pause. "The way Reed was talking, Mr. Marsh. The way he spoke to that man about the facilities, the revenue, the expansion plans." Another pause, heavier. "He spoke like the place already belonged to him." My grip tightened on the phone. I kept my voice even. "Thank you, Otto. Sit tight." "Yes, sir." I drove back to Gloucester instead of going home. I pulled into the Harbor Point lot and got out of the truck and stood there in the low gold light of late afternoon, looking at everything my father and I had built. The dock ran 300 feet out over the water, solid and straight. The planks I'd replaced 2 winters ago still pale and tight. The boathouse to the left, the fuel dock to the right. The service yard behind, with its hydraulic lift and workshop, and the smell of marine paint that had soaked into the concrete over 40 years. 3 sailboats on the north moorings, their rigging ticking softly in the evening breeze. The Harbor Point sign above the main gate, dark green letters on white. The lighthouse logo that my father had sketched on a napkin, and I'd had a sign painter render properly in 1987. My father's hands had laid those first pilings. My hands had driven every nail in the boathouse roof. My brother had stood on this dock and laughed and helped us paint and said, "I think we built something, Holden." And then he had come back from the dead to take it. My father's hands built this dock, I said, to the empty lot, to the evening air, to whatever was left of the people who had mattered. My hands expanded it. I looked out at the water, and my brother wanted to take it. Otto Briggs was waiting for me at the fuel dock. When I pulled into the Harbor Point lot the next morning, his hands shoved into the front pocket of his canvas work vest, his face carrying the particular tension of a man who has something to say and isn't sure how it will land. He was 61 years old, built broad and square from 2 decades of hauling gear and managing a working marina, with hands so calloused they looked like they'd been sanded down and refinished. I'd hired him 20 years ago when he showed up at my office door on a Tuesday morning, 41 years old, recently, off the fishing boats smelling faintly of brine and engine oil, with a resume that was mostly blank and eyes that were completely steady. "I just need honest work, Mr. Marsh," he'd said. "That's all I'm asking for." I'd hired him on the spot. In 20 years, he had never given me a single reason to regret it. "Walk with me," I said, and we moved away from the fuel dock toward the far end of the North Pier, where the morning wind off the water would carry our voices away from anyone nearby. "Tell me everything about yesterday," I said. "Reed and the man in the suit." Otto exhaled through his nose a tight, controlled sound. "They were here about 2 hours. Reed had a key to the main office, which—" He stopped. "I didn't know he had a key, Mr. Marsh. I want you to know that." "When did he get it?" "I don't know. It wasn't from me." Otto's jaw tightened. "They went through the filing cabinets in the back office. The revenue binders, the mooring agreements, the maintenance logs. The man in the suit, Voss, he was taking photographs on his phone. Of documents." He looked at me directly. "Reed kept saying things like, when we transition the operation, and once the new structure is in place. Not if, not maybe, when." The cold that moved through me had nothing to do with the May wind. "Otto," I said, "I need you to do something for me. And I need you to tell no one, not your wife, not the dock crew, not anyone. Name it. I need cameras inside the main office. Small ones. Here." I pulled out my phone and showed him the model I'd already looked up, a pair of compact wireless units, barely larger than a thumb drive, mountable in a bookcase or behind a filing tray. "I need them installed before the end of this week. Motion-activated continuous recording to a cloud account that only I can access." Otto looked at the phone screen, then at me. His forehead creased with genuine concern. "Mr. Marsh, is this as bad as it looks?" "It's worse," I said simply. He absorbed that without flinching. That was Otto. "I'll have them up by Thursday," he said. "Good man." I put my hand briefly on his shoulder. "Just keep doing your job, Otto. Pretend nothing has changed. Can you do that?" "I've been pretending nothing's wrong for 3 days already," he said, with a dry edge that surprised a short, humorless laugh out of me. "A few more won't kill me." The cameras went up on Thursday morning. 4 days later, Otto texted me a single word, footage. I drove to the marina in the early evening after the dock crew had gone home and sat alone in the small back office with the door closed and my laptop open on the desk. Otto stood outside the door, not listening, just present the way a good man stands when he knows something difficult is happening nearby. I opened the cloud folder and clicked on the most recent file. The angle was from the upper left corner of the office, looking down at the desk and both visitor chairs. The timestamp read 4:17 in the afternoon 2 days ago. Reed walked in first. He had his jacket off his sleeves, rolled, the relaxed body language of a man in a space he considers his own. Lena came in behind him and closed the door. Reed dropped into the chair behind the desk, my desk, and leaned back with his hands behind his head. "The old man is actually doing this," he said, and he was grinning. 40-year anniversary party. He's practically handing us the stage." Lena sat in the visitor chair across from him, crossing her legs, her expression more careful. "Don't get overconfident. He's been quieter than usual lately. He's grieving Lena." People get quiet when they grieve. Reed waved a hand. He'll give a speech, he'll get emotional, and then we move. Calder draws up the transfer documents. At the table, Dad signs in front of witnesses. We announce the transition to the guests. He spread his hands like a man displaying a finished product. Clean, public, impossible to walk back. Lena nodded slowly. Caspian wants everything done before the end of the month. It'll be done. Reed leaned forward. The old man will sign. I know him. He trusts us. The word trusts hit me somewhere in the chest cavity like a blunt object. I pressed my hand flat against the desk and kept my face neutral and kept watching. Just make sure Caspian stays back until the paperwork is done, Lena said. If Dad sees him before the right moment, the whole thing— Lena, Reed's voice sharpened slightly. I know the plan. I've known the plan for 19 years. Trust me. The recording ended there. I closed the laptop. Otto knocked twice and opened the door. You okay? No, I said. But I will be. He came in and leaned against the doorframe. What did you hear? Enough. I looked up at him. Otto, when Lena was talking, she mentioned someone. Called him by name. Not Vincent Hale. Another name. Otto straightened. What did she call him? I held his gaze. Dad. Something moved across Otto's face, a slow, painful rearrangement of features, like a man watching something fall from a great height. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Then he said roughly, How long has she known? A long time, I said. She's known for a long time. We stood there in the small office with the evening light coming flat and gold through the salt-filmed window, and I could see Otto working through it, the arithmetic of betrayal, the calculation of what it meant that the young woman he'd watched grow up on this dock had been playing a part the whole time. What do you need from me? He said finally, his voice steady again. One more thing, I said. I'm throwing a party. He blinked. A party. 40th anniversary of Harbor Point Marina. On the dock in 3 weeks. I stood up from the desk. I need you to send invitations to every employee, every current client, every business partner. I paused. And to read Lena Merrick Voss and a man named Vincent Hale. I picked up my pen and wrote Caspian's alias on the notepad and slid it across the desk to Otto. That address. Send one there. Otto looked at the name on the paper. And what happens at this party, Mr. Marsh? I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. The truth, I said. That's what happens. I stayed after Otto left, sitting at the desk, alone with the invitations stacked in front of me. I'd printed them myself, cream cardstock, Harbor Point letterhead, clean and formal. I picked up the last one, wrote Vincent Hale on the envelope in my own hand. Then underneath on the line where a second name might go, I wrote 2 words I hadn't written in 35 years. Caspian Marsh. I looked at it for a long time. Then I folded the envelope closed and pressed the seal down with my thumb slowly and deliberately. The way you close a door you've been standing in front of for a very long time. 35 years, Caspian, I thought. Let's finish this where it started, on the water. The call came at 8:43 in the morning, 1 week before the party. I was standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee watching a fishing boat make its way out past the breakwater in the early light when Reed's name appeared on my screen. I let it ring twice, not because I needed time to compose myself, but because I'd learned that the small pause before I answered gave me something useful. A moment to decide who I was going to be in the conversation. I answered. Morning, Reed. Dad. His voice was bright, almost buoyant, the voice of a man who believes he is days away from getting everything he wants. I'm so glad you're doing this party. I really am. 40 years, Dad. That's something worth celebrating. A warm, practiced pause. Mom would have wanted it. My hand tightened around the coffee mug. The knuckle went white. Mom would have wanted it. The woman who had spent 23 years feeding my brother a lie about the night I nearly died trying to save him. The woman whose voice I'd heard on a cassette tape saying she had never loved me. I'm glad you think so, I said pleasantly. Do you need help with the arrangements, catering the tent, anything like that? Lena and I are happy to handle logistics. I've got it handled, I said. I've been running events at that marina for 40 years, Reed. I know how to put up a tent. A brief laugh. Of course you do. The lightness in his voice didn't waver. It's going to be a great night, Dad. I really believe that. So do I said. I'll see you there. I hung up and set the phone on the counter and stood there looking at the fishing boat until it cleared the breakwater and disappeared into the open water. My chest felt like a room with all the furniture pushed to the walls, hollow in the middle edges, sharp. Mom would have wanted it. I thought about the tape. Celeste's voice unhurried and clear, Holden is a good man. But I never loved him the way I loved Caspian. I had listened to it 4 times now. Not because I needed to hear it again. Because some part of me kept expecting the words to change. They never did. Lena came by that afternoon unannounced the way she did every week or so, as if the regularity of it made the performance more convincing. She was carrying a paper bag from the bakery on Main Street, the almond croissants I'd always liked, and she set them on the table with a small, careful smile. Thought you could use something good, she said, sitting down across from me. Thank you, I said. I poured her a coffee. I set it down in front of her. My hands were steady. I had become very good at steady. She wrapped her hands around the mug and looked at me the way she'd been looking at me since Celeste passed, with eyes that were soft and searching, and slightly too attentive, like she was monitoring something. Dad? Her voice dropped into the gentle register she used when she was about to say something she'd rehearsed. Are you sure you're okay? You seem different lately. Since you started planning the party, I mean. There's something about you that feels... She tilted her head. I don't know. Like you're somewhere else. I looked at my daughter. At the curve of her jaw, and the way she held her coffee mug with both hands, which she'd done since she was 7 years old. At the small scar above her left eyebrow from the time she'd fallen off her bike on the driveway, and I'd carried her inside and held a cold cloth to her forehead while she cried and told me it didn't hurt, even though it clearly did. My chest cracked along a hairline fracture I couldn't let show. Just tired, sweetheart, I said. Just tired. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her fingers were warm. We're going to get through this together, okay, as a family. As a family, I repeated. Yes. She left an hour later, kissing my cheek at the door, taking the warmth of the performance with her. I closed the door and leaned my back against it and pressed both hands over my face and stood there in the entryway of my house, breathing carefully until the burning behind my eyes receded. That evening I drove to Dorian's. He had a fire going in the small fireplace in his living room, despite the fact that it was nearly June, because Dorian ran cold and always had. He handed me a glass of bourbon without asking and sat down in the chair across from mine and looked at me with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who had known me for 56 years. 1 week, he said. 1 week, I confirmed. How are you holding up? I keep looking at Lana and seeing the 7-year-old who wouldn't let me leave her hospital bedside, I said. The words came out rougher than I intended. And then I remember the footage from the camera. And those two things won't... I stopped, pressed my knuckle against my mouth for a moment. They won't sit in the same room in my head without tearing each other apart. Dorian leaned forward, elbows on his knees. That's not weakness, Holden. That's just what it costs to love people who turn out to be something other than what you thought. I know. I looked at the fire. Are you ready for this? Stellan's confirmed. I'll have him there by 8. Dorian's voice was even and certain. Calder's ready. Otto's ready. He looked at me steadily. Are you ready for this? I thought about it honestly. About standing up in front of everyone who had ever been part of Harbor Point and saying the unsayable. About seeing Caspian's face when the photographs appeared on that screen. About watching Reed's easy confidence collapse in real time. About looking at Lena and saying out loud the thing we had both been pretending wasn't true. No, I said, but ready doesn't matter anymore. Dorian held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the kind of nod that means good enough. I drove home just after 10. I changed into the black vest I'd had pressed and hanging on the back of the bedroom door since Tuesday. I stood in front of the mirror on the back of the closet door and looked at myself. The man looking back was 68 years old. His hair had gone fully white somewhere in the last decade without him particularly noticing. There were lines around his eyes and at the corners of his mouth that hadn't been there when he'd built Harbor Point's first boathouse. He looked frankly like a man who had lived a hard recent month, but his eyes were clear. For the first time in a very long time since before Celeste passed, since before the basement, since before all of it, his eyes were completely, unequivocally clear. I reached into the nightstand drawer and took out 3 things. My phone, my Harbor Point keychain, the original brass one my father had given me the day we filed the business license in 1985, worn smooth from 40 years of use, and a small black USB drive. I put all 3 in my vest pocket. Everything I needed was on that drive. Every photograph from the basement room, every scanned page of her diary, every word from that tape, every single word. I turned off the bedroom light and went downstairs to wait for morning. Harbor Point had never looked more beautiful than it did that evening. String lights ran the full length of the main dock, warm gold against the deepening blue of the June sky, their reflections trembling in the dark water below. Round tables with white cloths filled the deck area between the boathouse and the fuel station, each one lit by a hurricane lantern. The caterers had set up a bar at the far end, near the north moorings, and the soft sound of a jazz quartet drifted across the water from the small stage Otto had helped me arrange near the boathouse wall. The smell of the ocean mixed with grilled seafood and wine and the faint cedar scent of the dock planking warm from a full day of June sun. 83 people had confirmed. Employees, longtime clients, marine contractors, harbor officials, people who had watched Harbor Point grow from a scrubby waterfront lot into one of the most respected full-service marinas on the Cape Ann coast. I stood at the entrance gate in my black vest and watched them arrive, greeting each one with a handshake and a steady smile, and I thought about my father. Opening night, September 1985. He had stood on this same dock in his good suit, the one he only wore to church, and occasions that mattered, with his hand on my shoulder and a glass of cheap champagne in the other, and he'd looked out at the lights on the water with an expression I'd only ever seen on his face a handful of times. Pure, uncomplicated pride. "This is yours now, son," he'd said. "Don't ever let it go." I had not let it go. Not tonight. Reed arrived at 6:45, 20 minutes before the official start time. He was dressed sharply, charcoal jacket, open collar, and he was practically vibrating with a barely contained energy that he was working hard to present as simple enthusiasm. He crossed the dock toward me with his hand already extended and a wide, warm smile that under any other circumstances would have looked exactly like his father's. "Dad." He shook my hand and pulled me briefly into a hug, clapping me on the back. "This is incredible. The whole place looks amazing." He pulled back and looked at me with bright eyes. "Tonight's going to be great. Real closure for everything. A new chapter. Closure, I said. I held his gaze and smiled. Yes, that's exactly the right word. Something flickered briefly in his expression, too quick to catch gone before it landed. Then the smile came back. I'm going to go find Lena. We'll be right here if you need anything. I know you will, I said. He moved off into the growing crowd. I watched him go. Lena arrived at 7 with 2 people, a colleague from her firm, and the man she introduced as Vincent Hale. He was 66 years old. Taller than I'd expected from the photographs, leaner with silver hair cut short, and a face that had been rearranged by time, and I suspected at least one surgical procedure. He wore a good jacket and moved through the world with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades learning how to be someone he wasn't. The kite scar was there just below the left shirt cuff. I saw it when he reached out to take a glass of wine from a passing server. Lena touched his arm and steered him toward me with a bright social smile. Dad, I want you to meet someone. This is Vincent Hale. He's been a family friend for years. Vincent, this is my father, Holden Marsh. He turned to face me fully and put out his hand. I looked at him. 35 years. The face was different, the jaw heavier, the brow deeper, the eyes set behind lines that hadn't been there when we were young men painting a boathouse together on a Saturday morning. But the eyes themselves, the particular gray-green of them, the way they held a gaze steadily, without blinking too much or too little. The slight tension at the outer corners when he was working to appear relaxed. Those were my brother's eyes. I had grown up watching those eyes across a dinner table. They looked at me now, and something moved in them, something urgent and carefully suppressed. Fear, maybe, or guilt, or the vertigo of a man standing at the edge of something enormous that he has worked very hard to never approach. Vincent Hale, he said. His voice was steady. I had to give him that. I've heard a great deal about you, Mr. Marsh. I took his hand, shook it once firmly. All good things, I hope, I said. Of course. The edge of his mouth moved. Congratulations on 40 years. That's no small thing. No, I agreed. It isn't. Lena was watching us both with a smile fixed on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. I turned to her and kissed her cheek and told her she looked wonderful, and she laughed a little too quickly, and then a guest called her name from across the deck, and she moved away with visible relief. Caspian Vincent drifted into the crowd after her. I watched him go. 35 years, I thought. And you shook my hand and looked me in the eye. You've gotten very good at this. At 7:40, Reed materialized at my elbow with a glass of sparkling water and a lowered voice. So the plan for the speech, he started. I have the speech handled, Reed. I know, I just mean after once you've said the main thing about the history and the 40 years and everything, just leave a natural opening. He glanced around briefly and dropped his voice further. Say something like, and I'm excited about what comes next, and then step back. Calder can come up with the paperwork, and we do the handover announcement right there in front of everyone. He put his hand briefly on my arm. It'll look great, Dad. Organic. Like it was your idea. I looked at my son, at his handsome, eager face and the carefully constructed confidence behind it. At the 19-year-old who had sat with his mother and listened to her rewrite our family's history, and chosen again and again to believe her version because her version came with an inheritance. You've done enough handling Reed, I said very quietly and very clearly. Tonight is mine. His hand dropped from my arm. The confidence stuttered. Dad, go enjoy the party. I turned toward the stage. I'll see you in a few minutes. I walked to the steps at the side of the small stage and looked out at the crowd gathered on my dock, under my lights on the water my father had loved. Otto was positioned near the boathouse door, steady and watchful. Dorian stood near the bar, his eyes on me. Calder Flynn stood slightly apart from the main crowd, his briefcase at his feet. Caspian was near the back, standing beside Lena, a wine glass in his hand, his eyes tracking me as I climbed the steps. Merrick Voss stood to the left, holding a glass of red wine with the comfortable posture of a man attending what he expects to be a formality. Reed found a spot near the front, close enough to intervene if needed. He nodded at me, "Go ahead, Dad." We're ready, with the encouraging expression of a man who believes he has already won. They all thought they knew how this night would end. I stepped up to the microphone and looked out at all of them. They were wrong. Holden has been carrying this for weeks. The photographs, the diary, the DNA results, the tape recording of his wife's voice. Tonight, it all comes out. In front of everyone. Comment truth below so I know you're still here, because what happens next, nobody in that room saw it coming. Note this story includes fictional elements crafted to carry a message worth hearing. Names and details are illustrative, but the weight behind it is something real people carry every day. I did not use notes. I had written a speech 3 weeks ago, 2 pages careful, and measured the kind of remarks appropriate for a 40-year anniversary. I had thrown it away 4 days later and never written another one. What I had to say tonight did not belong on paper. I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the 83 faces looking back at me. The dock lights made everything warm and gold. The water moved quietly behind the crowd, the evening tide coming in slow and easy. 40 years ago, I said, I built this marina with my father and my brother. The crowd settled into attentive quiet. Reed, near the front, nodded with a small, encouraging smile. My father passed in 2009. Some of you knew him. He was the kind of man who drove a delivery truck for 22 years, so his sons could have a chance at something better than a delivery truck. He laid the first pilings of this dock with his own hands. Everything you're standing on tonight, he started it. A murmur of appreciation moved through the crowd. A few nods. My brother. I paused. Let the words sit for a moment. Most of you know I lost my brother in a storm at sea 35 years ago. I've observed a memorial for him every October since. I've carried that loss for longer than this marina has existed. The crowd was very still now. Reed's smile had softened into something more solemn, more appropriate, performing grief for an audience even now. Tonight, I said, I want to thank the truth, because it finally arrived. I reached into my vest pocket and took out the USB drive. I'd handed it to Otto 2 hours ago with instructions, and he'd loaded everything onto the presentation laptop connected to the screen behind the stage. I held the drive up briefly, not dramatically, just as a fact, and nodded to Otto at the back of the crowd. The screen behind me lit up. The first photograph appeared, Celeste on the deck of a sailing yacht. A sundress I'd never seen. Laughing with her head back, completely unguarded. The silver-haired man beside her, his hand easy on the rail. Reed to one side, Lena pressed against Celeste's shoulder, squinting into the sun. All 4 of them together framed by the blue of open water. And in Celeste's handwriting, along the white border at the bottom, Summer 2004, our real family. The sound that went through the crowd was not a gasp. It was something slower and more collective, a wave of comprehension moving from the front rows, backward person by person, as people read the caption and looked at the faces and began to understand what they were seeing. The dock went absolutely, completely quiet. Lena's face drained of color so fast it was like watching a light switch thrown. She reached one hand out and grabbed the back of the nearest chair and gripped it. Reed turned from the screen to me. The easy confidence was gone. In its place was something harder and more desperate. "Dad," his voice came out low and tight. "Turn that off." "No," I said. "Dad, for 30 years," I said, and my voice was steady, steadier than I had any right to expect it to be. "You all lived in the light. You had the photographs and the vacations and the truth and each other." I looked out at the crowd, at the faces turned toward me, and I kept my voice even and clear. I was the only one kept in the dark. I nodded to Otto again. The screen changed. Hawaii 2005. The black sand beach. The yellow dress. The man with the silver hair laughing beside my wife. Alaska 2007. The glacier-matching thermal jackets. Bahamas 2009. The catamaran at sunset. The nautical chart with the red circles. A scanned page of the journal, Celeste's handwriting filling the lines. The cover page of the Harbor Point transfer agreement with the name Vincent Hale visible in the acquiring party field. Merrick Voss set his wineglass down on the nearest table with a careful, deliberate click. His eyes moved around the crowd with the rapid assessment of a man calculating exits. Reed took a step toward the stage. "This isn't you don't understand what you're doing right now." "I understand exactly what I'm doing," I said. From the back of the crowd a chair scraped. A figure stood up. Caspian. He was on his feet, with his jaw set, and his eyes bright with something that looked like genuine outrage. The outrage of a man who has spent 35 years believing he was the wronged party and cannot yet process that the foundation of that belief has just been taken out from under him in public. "You have no right." His voice cracked across the dock, sharp and raw. Every head in the crowd turned toward him. I looked at my brother, at the face that was not the face I remembered, but was somehow still unmistakably him. At the gray-green eyes that were wide and burning, and directed at me with 35 years of accumulated, carefully maintained hatred. No right. My voice did not rise. I did not need it to. This was my wife. I pointed to the screen behind me where Celeste's face still glowed in the warm dock light. "That is my son." I pointed to Reed, who had gone very still. "This is the marina I built." I spread one hand to take in everything around us, the dock, the lights, the water. "And you." I held Caspian's gaze across the 30 feet of crowd between us and said his name out loud for the first time in 35 years. "Caspian are the brother I mourned every single October for the past 3.5 decades. The name landed like a depth charge. The ripple moved through the crowd instantly, people turning to each other, voices rising in confused, urgent undertones, everyone looking between me and the silver-haired man standing at the back of the gathering, with his face going white as paper. Merrick Voss turned to Caspian with an expression that had shifted from calculated composure to something considerably closer to alarm. "Who is this man?" he demanded, his voice carrying, despite his attempt to keep it low. I answered before Caspian could draw breath. "My brother," I said clearly into the microphone for everyone on that dock to hear. "The man who faked his death, changed his name, and spent 3 decades living with my wife. His name is Caspian Marsh, and every person standing on this dock tonight deserves to know that." The crowd broke open all at once. 83 people who had been holding collective breath released it in a wave of urgent, overlapping voices, turning to each other, reaching for arms, pointing at the screen, pointing at Caspian, pointing at me. The jazz quartet had stopped playing somewhere during the photographs, and the dock felt raw and exposed, without the music, just the sound of the ocean and the rising noise of people confronting something they hadn't come here expecting. Lena's voice cut through all of it. "Don't act like you're the only victim here." She had pushed forward from where she'd been standing near the back and was now 12 feet from the stage, her face flushed, her eyes red-rimmed and furious. Her composure, that careful, practiced composure she'd worn like a second skin every time she'd sat at my kitchen table, completely gone. The performance was over. What was underneath it was rawer and angrier than I'd expected. I looked at her and thought about the afternoon she'd brought almond croissants to my house and put her hand over mine and said, "We're going to get through this together as a family." How warm her hand had been. How completely I'd wanted in that moment to believe her. "Lena," I said. My voice came out steady and quiet, which was harder than anything else I'd done that night. "I raised you for 34 years. Holden," she started, "I taught you to ride a bike on the driveway of our house on Prospect Street. You were 6 years old, and you cried when you scraped your knee, and I sat on the asphalt with you for 20 minutes until you were ready to try again." My throat tightened around the words, but I kept going. "I sat up all night in a hospital chair when you were 7 years old, and your fever hit 103 and the doctor said to watch it, and I watched it every minute until it broke at 4 in the morning. I held her gaze across the crowd. "And you called that man Dad behind my back." Lena's face crumpled. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them. Just stood there with her jaw trembling, looking at me with an expression that was part guilt and part grief and part something that looked even now like defiance. "You're not my real father," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. The words hit me like a fist to the sternum. I felt them land. I let them land. "No," I said. "I'm not your biological father. That's true." I kept my eyes on hers. But I showed up every single day for 34 years. I was there. Every morning, every crisis, every ordinary Tuesday. My voice dropped. "That man," I gestured briefly toward where Caspian stood at the back of the crowd, "was never there. Not once. And you knew that. You've known it for years. You still chose him." Lena pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook with silent, heaving sobs that she was fighting to contain and losing. Reed stepped forward from the side. His jaw was set, his eyes bright with the desperate energy of a man trying to regain footing on shifting ground. "You want to talk about choices? I did this for Mom." His voice cracked at the edges, but held. "She said Caspian was the one who had everything taken from him. She said you had the marina, you had the life, you had everything, and he had nothing." I turned to look at my son. My actual son, blood of my blood, the boy I had taught to tie a bowline knot at age 9 on this exact dock. "And what about me, Reed?" I said. The quietness in my voice was deliberate, controlled. "You've known the truth since you were 19 years old. That's almost 20 years. I watched him flinch. "You sat with me at Caspian's memorial every single October. You stood next to me at that waterfront, and you watched me grieve your uncle, and you said nothing. You looked me in the eye, Reed, year after year." Reed opened his mouth, closed it. His hands flexed at his sides. "You want to tell me you did it for your mother," I said. "But your mother's been gone for 3 months. And 2 weeks after her funeral, you were in my marina office telling Merrick Voss that the transition was on schedule." I reached into my vest pocket and took out my phone and nodded to Otto at the back. The screen behind me changed. The marina office shot from the upper corner. Reed in my chair, jacket off sleeves rolled, leaning back with his hands behind his head. Lena across the desk. The audio came through the dock speakers with perfect clarity. "The old man will sign. After the anniversary party, we announce the transfer." The crowd went rigid. Reed's voice unmistakable coming from the speakers above the dock, where 40 years of clients and employees and people who had known him since childhood were now standing and listening. "The old man will sign," Reed's face went the color of old concrete. He looked at the screen, then at the crowd, and what I saw in his eyes in that moment was not anger and not defiance. It was the particular horror of a man hearing himself say the worst thing he has ever said, played back at full volume in public, with no way to take it back. The people nearest to him stepped back almost unconsciously, creating a small, empty circle around him. I looked at my son. I waited. Reed said nothing. For the first time all evening with the crowd watching, and the recording finished, and nowhere left. To maneuver Reed Marsh had absolutely nothing to say. His mouth worked once opened slightly and closed. His eyes were wet, and his jaw was trembling, and his hands hung at his sides completely still, and for one unguarded moment, he looked less like the man who had sat in my chair calling me the old man, and more like the 19-year-old who had stood in a kitchen doorway and listened to his mother rewrite his family's history and been too young and too afraid and too hungry for her approval to push back. It didn't absolve him, but I saw it. "That silence, Reed," I said very quietly. "That's the only honest thing you've done tonight." His chin dropped. He turned his face away. Calder Flynn moved. He came up the steps at the side of the stage without hurrying, carrying his briefcase, his face composed and professional. He set the briefcase on the table beside the podium and opened it and laid a bound document on the surface with a clean, deliberate motion. "My name is Calder Flynn," he said into the microphone. "I am Mr. Marsh's attorney of 40 years. I want the record to reflect that all forged signatures, all preliminary transfer agreements, and all documented evidence of conspiracy and coercion in this matter have been compiled and submitted to the appropriate authorities as of this morning." He looked out at the crowd without expression. "Anyone with questions about legal exposure in connection with this transaction should consult their own counsel immediately." From the far left edge of the gathering, Merrick Voss was already moving. He set his wineglass on the nearest table without looking at it, straightened his jacket, and walked at a brisk, controlled pace toward the marina exit. "I want no part of this," he said to no one in particular, not stopping, not looking back. The dock buzzed and shifted as people watched him go. I stood at the microphone and looked at Reed, who still hadn't raised his head, and at Lena, who was wiping her face with the back of her hand and staring at the dock planking like she was trying to memorize the grain of the wood. There was one more person left to face. The crowd had thinned. Some guests had left during the camera footage. Others stayed held in place by the particular gravity of witnessing something that could not be unseen. They stood in loose clusters on the dock, voices, low eyes moving between me and the silver-haired man near the back, who had not moved since I'd said his name. Caspian Marsh stood alone. Lena had moved away from him after the footage played, not dramatically, not with words, just a slow, incremental drift, until she was standing 6 feet to his left, instead of beside him, which was its own kind of verdict. Reed had sat down at one of the tables with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. Merrick Voss was already gone. I stepped down from the stage. The crowd parted slightly as I walked through it, not quickly, not urgently. I crossed the dock until I was standing 10 feet from my brother in the gold light of the string lamps, with the Atlantic moving dark and quiet behind him, and 35 years of accumulated wreckage between us. Caspian's hands were shaking. Not the fine tremors of cold, full visible, shaking the kind that comes from the bottom of something. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were wet, and he was fighting hard against whatever was trying to get out of him and losing. "You left me out there." His voice came out raw and rough, scraping over the words like they hurt on the way up. "I was in the water, Holden. I was calling your name and you swam away. I nearly died because of you. 35 years of that belief. 35 years of waking up with it going to sleep, with it building an entire life and an entire identity on the foundation of it. I could see all of it in his face right now, not just the accusation, but the need for the accusation to be true, because if it wasn't true, then everything he had done in its name collapsed with it. I looked at Dorian. Dorian Hale crossed the dock without hesitation. He was carrying the folder, the one with the photocopied rescue log from 1988, the one he'd kept in a cardboard box in his back hallway for 36 years. He set it on the table nearest to us, opened the pages, face up. Caspian. Dorian's voice was direct and unhurried, the voice of a man giving testimony. I was the rescue swimmer on the primary vessel that night. I was 20 meters off your position when your brother went in the first time. He pointed at the pages. He went in twice. The second time he went under and didn't come back up on his own. I pulled him out myself. He was not breathing when I got him onto the deck. Dorian's jaw tightened. He did not swim away from you. He was carried away from you unconscious. Caspian's eyes dropped to the document on the table. His lips moved slightly as he read. The shaking in his hands got worse. From the edge of the remaining crowd, a figure stepped forward. Stellan Cross moved slowly. His knees were bad and the dock planking was uneven, but his steps were deliberate and his pale eyes were steady. He was 72 years old, and he'd driven down from Rockport that afternoon at my request, and he stood now beside Dorian with the quiet authority of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something in the right room. I was on the secondary support vessel that night, Stellan said loud enough for everyone remaining on the dock to hear. I had eyes on your brother from 40 yards out. He went in twice. The second time I watched Dorian go in after him. He looked directly at Caspian. Holden Marsh was screaming your name until he lost his voice. I could hear him over the wind. I have never in 30 years of rescue work seen a man fight that hard to stay in the water. Caspian stared at Stellan. His face was the color of wet ash. His mouth opened, and a sound came out that wasn't quite a word, something broken and involuntary like a door coming off a hinge. I walked to Otto and nodded. He pulled up the final file on the presentation laptop. The rescue report appeared on the screen behind the stage, Stellan's own handwritten log entry, blown up large enough to read from the dock. R. Calloway entered the water a second time, disregarding the order to retreat. I have served 12 years in active maritime rescue. I have not seen a man go back in under those conditions before or since. Caspian read it. I watched him read it. I watched his chest rise and fall in rapid, shallow breaths, watched his hand come up and press hard against his sternum like he was trying to hold something inside. Watched the 35-year architecture of his anger crack from the foundation up in real time. She told you I abandoned you, I said, because if we ever made peace, if you ever found out what actually happened that night, and forgave me, she would have lost us both. She needed you to hate me. That was the only way she could keep you. Caspian's head moved from side to side, a slow, disbelieving motion. She wouldn't. Listen, I said. I took out my phone, opened the audio file, pressed play. Celeste's voice filled the dock clear and unhurried, carrying over the sound of the water. If Caspian ever finds out that Holden tried to save him, if he ever learns the truth about that night, everything falls apart. Caspian stays because he believes Holden chose himself. Take that away, and I have nothing to hold him with. I can't lose Caspian again. I won't. The recording ended. The dock was so quiet, I could hear the individual halyards on the nearest sailboat ticking against the mast in the evening breeze. 80 people stood without speaking, without moving, the weight of those words settling over all of us like something physical. Caspian sat down. Not into a chair, there was no chair behind him. He sat down onto the dock, planking itself heavily, both hands planted on the wood, his head dropping forward, his whole body folding under something that had been suspended for 35 years and had just all at once come down. 35 years. His voice was barely audible, scraped hollow. I hated you for 35 years. I stood over my brother, this stranger, who was still somehow the boy who had painted a boathouse wall beside me on a Saturday morning, who had stood on our father's dock and said, I think we built something, and I looked at him for a long time. Not as a victim looks at the person who hurt him. Not as an investigator looks at a subject. The way an older brother looks at the younger one after something has gone very wrong and cannot be entirely undone but must somehow be acknowledged. I know, I said. The party didn't end so much as it dissolved. There was no formal conclusion, no final toast, no moment where someone said, That's it, it's over. People simply began to leave in ones and twos at first, then in larger groups gathering their jackets and their spouses and their expressions of stunned private discomfort, and making their way off the dock with the careful movements of people who have witnessed something they will be processing for a long time. Calder intercepted Reed near the main gate. I watched from the stage steps as my attorney placed himself in front of my son with a document in hand and spoke to him in a low, even voice that carried no warmth and no flexibility. Reed's face went through several iterations, resistance, then calculation, then a kind of deflated gray resignation as Calder walked him through exactly what had been filed, what it meant, and what Reed's options were going forward. Which from the look on Reed's face were not many. Lena left without speaking to me again. She walked past the stage with her head down and her arms crossed over her chest, and her eyes red and swollen from crying, and she didn't look up as she passed. I watched her go. My chest ached with the particular specific pain of watching someone you raised walk away from you. And I let the pain be there because trying to push it away had never worked for me. And I was too old to start now. Don't ever let it go, my father had said. Standing on this exact dock in this exact spot with his hand on my shoulder, and 40 years of a delivery driver's savings poured into the ground beneath our feet. He hadn't been talking only about the marina. I stepped back up to the microphone one last time. Maybe 30 people remained, mostly employees, a few longtime clients, who hadn't been able to bring themselves to leave Dorian near the boathouse wall, Otto by the gate. I want to say one more thing, I said. My voice was tired now. I didn't try to hide it. Harbor Point Marina is not for sale. It was not for sale last month, it is not for sale tonight, and it will not be for sale tomorrow. I looked out at the people who had worked beside me, some of them for decades, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight for months. From tonight, Reed and Lena Marsh have no management authority over this property. The man who came here this evening as Vincent Hale, whose name is Caspian Marsh, is not permitted on these premises. All fraudulent documents and transfer agreements have been submitted to the appropriate legal authorities. I paused. That's all. Thank you for being here. Go home safe. The remaining guests drifted off in the next 20 minutes. The caterers began breaking down the tables. Otto moved through the dock, quietly collecting glasses, coiling electrical cords, doing the patient work of putting a place back to rights after something has come through it. And then there were 3 of us on the dock. Me. Dorian standing 20 feet back near the boathouse, giving me space the way he'd always known how to do. And Caspian, who had not left. He was standing at the far end of the main pier, at the railing that looked out over the open harbor, his back to me, both hands gripping the wood. The string lights were still on. In their warm gold glow with the dark water moving below him, and the night sky above, he looked smaller than he had at any point during the evening. Older. Like a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and had just been told that the thing he'd been holding wasn't real. I walked the length of the pier and stopped 8 feet behind him. He turned at the sound of my footsteps. His eyes were red. Not from crying, or not only from crying, but from the particular physiological devastation of having a 35-year belief system dismantled in public in under an hour. His hands dropped from the railing. He looked at me with an expression I didn't have a name for, something between pleading and shame, and the remnants of an anger that had nowhere left to go. "Holden." His voice was wrecked, stripped down to something bare and undefended that I hadn't heard from him in 35 years, because the last time I'd heard that voice he'd been 29 years old and standing on the deck of a boat in a November storm. "Can we start over?" I looked at him. I looked at the harbor beyond him, at the lights of the town reflected in the black water, at the buoy light blinking slow and patient out past the breakwater. I thought about our father's hands on these dock pilings. I thought about Caspian, at 22 years old, laughing with paint on his jeans. I thought about the 35 years between then and now, and everything that had been built in that space and everything that had been destroyed. "My brother died 35 years ago in a storm," I said. "I watched the Coast Guard call off the search. I went to the waterfront every October for 35 years and said his name into the wind." My voice stayed level. I needed it to stay level for this. The man standing in front of me right now is someone who came back from that storm, changed his name, moved into my life through the back door, and helped plan the theft of something my father built. I held his gaze. Those aren't the same person. Caspian's jaw worked. "I didn't know the truth, Holden. About the rescue. About what she told me." His voice broke on the next words. "If I had known." "I believe you didn't know," I said. "I do. I believe Celeste constructed that lie and maintained it and fed it to you every time it needed reinforcing for 23 years. I paused. "That doesn't change what happened between then and now. It doesn't undo the plan. It doesn't undo the photographs, the journal, the transfer agreement with your name on it." My voice dropped. "You know the truth now. But knowing late doesn't mean forgiveness is owed." Something in Caspian's face broke open fully, then, not dramatically, not with a sound, but in the way that sometimes the most devastating things happen quietly. His chin dropped. His shoulders curved forward. He pressed one hand over his eyes, and I could see by the tremor in his wrist how hard he was working to hold himself together, and how completely he was failing. "I wasted it," he said, muffled behind his hand. "I wasted 35 years hating you for something you didn't do." "Yes," I said. "You did." He looked up. His eyes were raw and wet, and searching my face for something, mercy maybe, or the remnant of a brotherhood that had survived everything else. I looked back at him, and I was honest with myself about what I found. Not hatred. I want to be clear about that. What I felt standing on the end of that dock, looking at my brother's ruined face, was not hatred, and it was not rage. It was something quieter and more final. The recognition that grief has a capacity like any container, and mine had been filled to the top a long time ago, and had nothing left in it for this. Caspian lowered his hand. He straightened slowly like a man getting up off a floor. He looked at me for one more moment, a long, searching look that asked a question I didn't have the answer he needed, and then he turned away. He walked the length of the pier without looking back. Past the boathouse. Past the gate. The sound of his footsteps faded against the dock planking, and then he was gone into the dark beyond the lights, and I stood at the railing and watched the space where he'd been. I didn't hate him, I thought. I just didn't have anything left to give him. A hand came down on my shoulder. Dorian beside me now, looking out at the same harbor. "What now?" he asked. I looked at Harbor Point Marina, the string lights still warm in the June dark, the boats rocking at their moorings, patient and reliable. The boathouse my father and I had built board by board, the fuel dock, the Harbor Point sign with its lighthouse logo, and its 40 years of salt air and sun. Don't ever let it go. Now, I said, I figure out what the rest of my life looks like, without any of them in it. Dorian's hand tightened briefly on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We stood there together on the dock for a long time after that, just the two of us and the sound of the water. July came in warm and bright, the way Cape Ann summers sometimes do, all salt air and clear mornings, and the particular golden light that bounces off the water and into the windows of every building facing the harbor. I was in the marina office by 6:45 most mornings now, earlier than I'd kept for years. I'd start the coffee, pull up the daily operations log on the computer, check the weather service for the week ahead, and sit for a while in the quiet before Otto and the dock crew arrived and the working day began. It was the best part of every day, mine and no one else's. Otto appeared in the doorway at 7:15 on a Thursday in late July, coffee in hand, his canvas work vest already on, and looked at me with the expression he'd been wearing for 3 weeks, steady, careful, watching for something without being obvious about it. "You eat breakfast this morning?" he asked. "I had coffee," I said. "That's not breakfast." He set a paper bag on the corner of my desk, something from the bakery on Main Street. "Eat," he said, in the tone of a man who has decided that feeding his employer is part of his job description. I almost smiled. "Thank you, Otto." He nodded once and headed back out to the dock. I opened the bag. A blueberry muffin still warm. I sat there in the morning light, eating it slowly, and listening to the sounds of Harbor Point waking up. Footsteps on the dock, planking the hydraulic lift in the service yard, running its morning test. The particular creak of the north moorings as the tide started coming in. And I thought about how much I had taken all of it for granted for 40 years. The ordinary daily presence of this place. The way it just kept running morning after morning, indifferent to everything that had happened in its orbit. My phone showed 7 missed calls from Reed since the party. The last one had come in 4 days ago. I'd watched it ring each time and done nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Lena's letter had arrived by post 12 days after the party. Handwritten 4 pages, her careful rounded script filling the lines. I'd made myself a cup of coffee before I opened it, and I'd read it all the way through twice sitting at my kitchen table in the early morning. She was sorry. She said it in more ways and with more detail than I'd expected. Not the performative sorry of someone covering their position, but something that sounded more like a person who had been awake at 3 in the morning, reckoning with themselves. She wrote about the night her mother had told her the truth she'd been 25, and Reed had been the one who sat her down and explained it. And she'd cried for 2 days and then slowly, gradually, let herself be pulled into the logic of it. She wrote about how she'd told herself it didn't change anything, that Holden was still her father in every way that mattered, and how she'd believed that until she realized she'd stopped acting like it was true. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't ask me to call, or to forgive, or to pretend. She just said she was sorry, and that she would understand whatever I decided. I folded the letter back into its envelope. I opened the bottom drawer of the kitchen desk, the one where I'd always kept things I wasn't ready to deal with, but couldn't bring myself to discard, and I put it in there and closed the drawer. I didn't forgive her. I want to be honest about that. The forgiveness people talk about, the clean releasing kind, the kind that sets both parties free. I wasn't there yet, and I didn't know if I would be. What I had was something messier and more honest. I couldn't burn the letter. I couldn't throw it away. I put it in the drawer and left it there. Maybe that was the closest thing to mercy I had left. The marina sale of the tour operation portion had closed the previous week. I'd sold the luxury charter coordination business, the part Celeste had built the high-end touring contracts and client relationships, to a reputable operator out of Newburyport who'd been trying to acquire it for 2 years. I kept Harbor Point itself, the dock, the moorings, the service yard, the boathouse, the fuel station, the bones of what my father had started. With the proceeds, I set up a fund. Otto found out about it the morning I called the bank to finalize the structure. He came into the office with a mooring report and stopped when he saw me on the phone with the trust administrator and waited until I hung up. "What's that for?" he asked, nodding at the papers on the desk. "Maritime Vocational Program," I said. "Kids in Gloucester and Rockport who want to learn the trade but can't afford the training costs. We'll cover certifications, equipment, apprenticeship fees. Start with 10 slots per year and see where it goes." Otto looked at the papers for a moment. His expression did the thing it sometimes did, that careful rearrangement of features that meant he was feeling something he wasn't going to name out loud. "What do we call it?" he asked. I thought about it. I thought about my father's name, and Celeste's name, and Caspian's name, and all the names that had been attached to Harbor Point over 40 years in ways I was still untangling. "Harbor Point Youth Fund," I said. "Just that. Nothing else." Otto nodded slowly. "Good name," he said. "Clean. That's the idea." He went back out to the dock. I sat with the papers and the morning light and the sound of the water, and I thought about the 10 kids who would come through that program next year. Kids who didn't know yet what they were going to do with their lives, who just needed someone to open a door, and something in my chest unclenched that had been tight since March. Dorian came by on a Friday afternoon in early August, unannounced as always, carrying 2 bottles of beer from the place on Rogers Street that we'd been going to since 1987. He let himself into the office, set 1 bottle on my desk without asking, dropped into the chair across from mine, and stretched his legs out. "You look better," he said, studying my face with the frank assessment of someone who has known you long enough to track the changes. "I feel better," I said. Which was true and was also a thing I hadn't been able to say with any honesty for a long time. "Read?" he asked. "Still calling. I'm not ready." "Lena." She wrote. I read it. I looked at the desk drawer for a moment. "I'm not ready for that either." Dorian nodded. He picked up his bottle and looked out the window at the harbor, the afternoon light on the water. A sailboat, making its way out toward the open sea. On the outgoing tide, the lighthouse on the point, doing its slow, patient work. "You doing okay, old man?" he asked. I looked out at the same view. The boats, the water, the light. Harbor Point Marina in a late summer afternoon, 40 years old, and still standing, still running, still mine. For the first time in a long time, "Dorian," I said, "I think I actually might be." He raised his bottle toward me slightly. I raised mine back. Outside, the tide kept coming in. I found Dorian sitting on the south dock at 5:30 in the morning. He was already there when I came down with my thermos and my jacket sitting on the dock railing, with his boots dangling over the water, 2 cups of coffee from the gas station on Rogers Street, sitting beside him in a cardboard carrier, looking out at the harbor, like a man who had been awake for a while and had made his peace with it. I stopped when I saw him. "You knew I'd be here. You always come to the water when something's ending." He picked up one of the cups and held it out toward me without turning around. "Sit down, Holden." I sat on the railing beside him, took the cup. The coffee was hot and bad, and exactly what I needed. For a moment, neither of us said anything, not the uncomfortable kind of nothing, but the kind that only happens between people who have known each other long enough that silence is just another form of conversation. The harbor was dark and flat. The string lights from the party, long since taken down the dock, quiet, except for the creak of the moorings and the slow movement of the tide. "How are you actually doing?" Dorian asked. Not the social version of the question. The real one. I thought about it honestly. Some mornings I wake up and for about 30 seconds I forget everything that happened. And then I remember. I looked at my coffee. The 30 seconds are nice. And after the 30 seconds, I get up and make coffee and go to work. I paused. It's getting easier to do that. The getting up part. Dorian nodded slowly. "Reed called me last week," he said. I looked at him. "What did he say?" "He asked me if I thought you'd ever talk to him again." Dorian turned his cup in his hands. I told him I didn't know. That it wasn't my question to answer. He glanced at me sideways. "Is it ever?" I looked out at the water for a long moment. The eastern sky was beginning to separate from the sea, that first barely perceptible difference between where the dark water ended and where the dark sky began. "I don't know yet," I said. "Maybe someday, not now." I exhaled. "He's my son, Dorian. That doesn't go away just because he broke something." My chest tightened. "But broken things need time before you can figure out if they're worth fixing." "Fair enough." Dorian drank his coffee. "What about Lena? She wrote me a letter." I looked at my hands wrapped around the cup. 4 pages, handwritten. My throat tightened slightly on the next words. She sounded like herself. The real version, not the performed one. I stopped. Breathed. "I put it in a drawer." "You didn't throw it away?" "No." "That means something," Dorian said. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just couldn't bring myself to throw away 4 pages of my daughter's handwriting." I felt the familiar crack run through my chest, that hairline fracture that hadn't fully closed, and maybe never would. "Either way, it's in the drawer." Dorian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And Caspian." I hadn't spoken his name out loud since the night of the party. I sat with it for a moment. The name, the weight of it, everything it had meant for 66 years, and everything it meant now. "Caspian chose to stay dead for 35 years, I said. "That was his decision, not mine. And I spent 35 years grieving a man who was alive and building a different life on the wreckage of our family." My jaw tightened. I don't have anger left for him. I used it all up somewhere around week 3. I looked out at the horizon. What I have is just distance, like looking at a photograph of someone you used to know. "Do you think he'll come back?" Dorian asked. "I think he'll have to figure out who he is now that the story he'd been living isn't true anymore," I said. "That's not a small thing. That might take the rest of his life." I paused. "But that's his work to do, not mine." Dorian turned to look at me fully, then that direct, unhurried look he'd been giving me since we were 12 years old, the one that meant he was measuring something he actually cared about. "You know what I see when I look at you right now," he said. "Old man on a dock at 5:30 in the morning." He almost smiled. "I see the same guy who showed up at my door in 1984 with a hand-drawn blueprint of a marina and $40,000 and absolutely no rational reason to believe it would work." He held my gaze. "That guy is still there, Holden. Everything they did, Celeste, Caspian, Reed, Lena, all of it, and that guy is still there." My eyes went hot. I pressed my knuckle hard against the corner of my eye and held it there for a second. "Don't do that," I said, my voice coming out rough. "Too late," Dorian said, completely unrepentant. "Already did it." I laughed. Short and broken and genuine, the first real laugh I'd produced in longer than I could accurately remember. It surprised me. It surprised Dorian too, from the look on his face, though he covered it quickly. I finished my coffee, set the empty cup down on the dock between us. "I'm taking the boat out," I said. "I know." Dorian picked up the cardboard carrier and stood his knees cracking audibly. "Go. I'll check in with Otto." I stepped down into the 16-footer and ran the lines through my hands, checking them the way my father had taught me, the way I had done 10,000 times, the way I would do 10,000 more. Everything secure. Everything where it should be. "Dorian," I said. He stopped at the dock ladder. "Yeah. Thank you." I looked up at him. "For all of it. The box in your hallway. Stellan. Everything." My throat moved. "I wouldn't have gotten through this without you." He looked at me for a moment with an expression that was warm and gruff and entirely Dorian. "Yes, you would have," he said. "You just would have taken longer." He turned and walked back up the dock toward the office. I started the motor and let the boat run, past the breakwater, past the channel markers, past the point where the harbor opens into the open Atlantic and the bottom drops away. I cut the engine and let the boat drift. The sun came up while I sat there. It broke the horizon the way it does out here, sudden and complete, a hard gold edge that turned the whole surface of the water from pewter to copper to living light in seconds. I felt it on my face and closed my eyes for a moment and just let it be warm. Celeste had taken 30 years of truth. Caspian had taken a brother. My children had taken my trust in the version of my family I had believed in. All of that was real. All of it had happened. None of it was going away. But Harbor Point was still running. Otto had opened the gate 20 minutes ago. I could see the light in the office window from here, a small warm square against the morning. The youth fund applications opened next month. The dock my father had built was still standing after 40 years of weather and tide and everything else the Atlantic could throw at it. They hadn't taken any of that. They couldn't. Because some things, if you build them right and tend them honestly, will outlast everything that tries to bring them down. What's left, I thought, turns out to be enough. I reached for my thermos, poured the last of my coffee into the cap, drank it slowly, watching the light spread across the water, watching Harbor Point come fully awake in the distance. 1 cup. All mine. Every last drop. I pulled the motor cord. It caught on the first try. I turned the bow toward home. That's my story. A grandpa story about a man who spent 38 years trusting the wrong people, and one morning finally chose to trust himself. If there's anything I've learned from all of this, it's simple. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone buries it. It waits. And when it finally surfaces, it costs more than if you'd faced it early. I think about what I lost: a wife, a brother, the version of my children I believed in. But I also think about God and how sometimes He hides the things we need to find in the most painful places. That basement room didn't destroy me. It freed me. This is a family story that I'm not proud of, but I'm sharing it because someone out there might be sitting across the table from a second cup of tea that no one is drinking, going through the motions of a life that stopped being real a long time ago. Don't do what I did. Don't wait for the bookshelf to move. Ask the hard questions while there's still time to hear the answers. Because in every grandpa story, in every family story worth telling, the most important chapter is the one where someone finally tells the truth. If this grandpa story reached you in some way, leave a comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you for staying until the end. The following stories contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and life lessons. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves your heart best.